In March 241 BCE, the sea west of Sicily filled with shattered hulls, drifting cargo, and the wreckage of a Carthaginian fleet. Rome, the republic that had entered the First Punic War without a battle fleet comparable to Carthage's, had just won the naval victory that would end a war lasting more than 2 decades. But the strangest part was how it got there. 20 years earlier, Roman crews were so inexperienced that Carthage had every reason to expect an easy fight. So Rome stopped trying to fight the kind of sea battle Carthage had perfected. It copied the enemy's warship, mounted a 36-foot boarding bridge on the bow, and turned ships into floating infantry platforms. At Mylae, Carthaginian captains sailed toward amateurs. What they reached instead were Roman legionaries waiting behind a falling iron spike. Rome did not begin by mastering naval warfare. It began by changing what naval warfare meant. And then the sea demanded something even harder. When the First Punic War began, in 264 BCE, Rome already knew how to make war on land. Its political system could raise legions, replace losses, build roads, and grind through fortified cities. But Sicily was not central Italy. It was an island battlefield, wrapped in shipping lanes. Carthage could move soldiers, money, grain, horses, and reinforcements along the coast. A Roman army could capture a city and still watch the enemy reappear somewhere else by sea. After the Roman victory at Agrigentum, the problem became impossible to ignore. Winning on land was not enough if Carthage remained free to use the water around the battlefield. If Rome could not contest the sea, every success in Sicily risked becoming temporary. And Rome had an embarrassing weakness. When Roman troops first crossed to Messana, Polybius says they relied on vessels borrowed from allied Greek cities such as Tarentum, Locri, Elea, and Neapolis. Rome possessed maritime experience of its own, but nothing resembling the large battle fleet Carthage could place into the western Mediterranean. Now imagine the strategic map from Rome. To the south lay Sicily, beyond it, Carthage. Between them was water controlled by an enemy whose naval traditions had been built over generations. Roman roads ended at the shoreline. A road that ends at the sea is not a supply line, it is a dead end. So around 261 BCE, Rome made an extraordinary decision. Build 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes. The number was astonishing. The experience behind it was not. According to Polybius, Roman shipbuilders were unfamiliar with constructing quinqueremes. Rome was ordering a major battle fleet before it fully understood how to reproduce the principal heavy warship of the enemy. Then fortune provided a model. A Carthaginian decked warship had run aground and fallen into Roman hands. Polybius says the Romans used it as a pattern for their new quinqueremes. That solved the shape of the ship. It did not solve the men inside it. A quinquereme was not simply a wooden box carrying soldiers. It was a human machine. Hundreds of rowers had to pull in rhythm, accelerate together, slow together, reverse together, and turn a long hull while officers judged distance on moving water. A badly handled warship could expose its side to a bronze ram and be opened below the waterline before its marines ever touched the enemy. So, while hulls rose in the shipyards, Roman crews reportedly rehearsed rowing on land. Men sat in rows arranged like the benches of a ship, practicing the movement of the oars at the command of an instructor. It was naval training without the sea. Then, in 260 BCE, Rome received a brutal lesson in how much it still did not know. The consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio sailed ahead with 17 ships toward Lipara. A Carthaginian squadron of 20 ships under Buedes moved in during the night and sealed the Romans inside the harbor. At dawn, many Roman crews fled toward land. Scipio surrendered. The ships were captured with him. The first experiment had found its first crack. Rome had copied the hardware, but Carthage still understood the environment. The rest of the fleet reached Sicily and passed to the other consul, Gaius Duilius. The Romans now knew exactly what was wrong with their new navy. Their ships were difficult to handle, their crews were inexperienced, and a conventional Mediterranean naval battle began long before soldiers could fight hand to hand. A skilled captain wanted space. He wanted speed. He wanted an angle. A well-drilled crew could accelerate past an opponent's bow, shear away oars, turn onto a vulnerable flank, or drive a bronze ram into the side of a hull. Rome was weakest in precisely that phase. So instead of waiting years to become better at everything Carthage already knew, the Romans tried to remove as much of that phase as possible. Their answer was not elegant. It was a wooden bridge with an iron tooth. Near the bow rose a vertical pole roughly 24 feet high. Around it pivoted a gangway about 36 feet long and 4 feet wide. Rails ran along both sides. At the outer end hung a heavy iron spike. The Romans called the device the corvus, the raven. A rope and pulley held the bridge upright as the ships approached. Once an enemy vessel came within reach, the Romans could swing the gangway toward it and let it fall. The spike punched into the enemy deck. Two moving warships became one temporary battlefield. That changed the geometry of the fight. Picture it from a Carthaginian captain's deck. His advantage existed while water remained between the ships. He could turn faster. His rowers could exploit an opening. His helmsman could choose the angle of attack. But to ram a Roman vessel, he still had to come close. That was the decision debt hidden inside Carthage's superiority. The closer its ships came to exploit their naval advantage, the closer they came to the Roman device designed to neutralize it. Once the corvus caught the deck, Roman soldiers advanced across it two abreast. Polybius describes the first men covering themselves with shields, while those behind used the rails to protect their sides. The Romans were not merely building a bridge, they were building a narrow infantry lane. A legionary did not need to outrow a Punic sailor once his sandals hit enemy planks. He needed balance, a shield, a sword, and the discipline to keep moving forward while another armed man tried to stop him. Rome's weakness was becoming the mechanism of the trap. Its fleet could not yet move like Carthage's. So, Rome designed a battle in which movement ended violently. But the corvus had a serious limitation. It could do nothing at 50 yards. It could do nothing against a ship that refused to enter its reach. Roman crews still had to survive long enough to force contact. If Carthage understood the mechanism before committing, the new fleet could still be outmaneuvered and destroyed. Nobody yet knew what would happen when a heavy gangway crashed onto the deck of a moving warship in real combat. That test came near Mylae, on the northern coast of Sicily. Duilius learned that the Carthaginian fleet was nearby and sailed toward it. The Carthaginians had every reason to feel confident. They had already captured one Roman consul. They knew the Roman ships were awkward. They knew which side possessed generations of naval experience. When roughly 130 Carthaginian warships sighted the Romans, Polybius says the leading ships advanced with such contempt that they did not even bother to organize themselves properly for battle. Then the first corvus dropped. The iron spike bit into a deck. Roman marines crossed. Another bridge fell. Then another. The first 30 Carthaginian ships were taken with their crews. Among them was the commander Hannibal's enormous 7-banked flagship, a vessel that had once belonged to King Pyrrhus. Hannibal escaped the captured ship in a smaller boat. Now the Carthaginians understood the device. They changed their approach. Instead of driving directly toward Roman bows, captains tried to attack from the sides and sterns, where they expected the bridges to be useless. But the corvus could pivot around its pole. Roman crews swung the gangways toward the new direction of attack and dropped them again. The Carthaginians had found the trap only after sailing into the distance at which it worked. By the time they withdrew, Polybius says they had lost about 50 ships. At Mylae, Rome did not suddenly become the better navy. It made being the better navy less useful. The victory changed Roman ambition. A fleet created almost from scratch had survived contact with the greatest maritime power in the Western Mediterranean. Rome could now imagine something more dangerous than defending the coast of Sicily. It could imagine carrying the war to Africa. 4 years later, in 256 BCE, that idea produced one of the largest fleet concentrations recorded in the ancient world. Polybius gives the Romans 330 decked warships and the Carthaginians 350. He calculated an enormous number of men aboard the Roman fleet, though totals on this scale should be treated cautiously. The operational problem is clear, even without accepting every ancient figure literally. Rome was not merely moving warships, it was moving an invasion army through enemy-controlled water. Near Cape Ecnomus, the Roman formation looked like a floating fortress. 2 consular ships formed the point. Behind them, 2 long columns widened apart, creating a wedge. A third squadron closed the rear of the triangle. Behind that line came transports, including vessels carrying horses, attached by towing ropes. A 4th squadron protected the back. The vulnerable center was obvious. If Carthage could pull the Roman fighting ships away, The slow transports behind them could be isolated before the army ever reached Africa. That was exactly what the Carthaginian plan tried to do. Their center gave ground, drawing the Roman front forward. As the Roman formation stretched and broke into separate groups, the Carthaginian wings attacked the exposed rear and the transport screen. For a time, one Roman movement became three separate battles. The neat wedge disappeared into clusters of ships. Orders traveled slowly. Squadrons lost sight of one another. Transports that had been protected by layers of warships suddenly faced enemy attack. But Rome now possessed something it had lacked at the beginning of the war: combat experience at sea. Roman squadrons that broke through one part of the Carthaginian formation turned back to support the sections under pressure. The corvus still made close approaches dangerous, while Roman marines remained lethal once contact was forced. Eventually, the scattered pieces of the Roman formation reconnected. Polybius gives the final Roman loss as 24 ships destroyed. Carthage lost more than 30 sunk and 64 captured. The road to Africa was open. That was the second reversal. At Mylae, Rome had used infantry tactics to survive a naval battle. At Ecnomus, it used a navy to move an army across the sea. But one danger had not changed at all. Every Roman success still depended on wooden hulls, exhausted rowers, weather, coastline, and commanders learning an environment that did not forgive mistakes. Carthage had failed to stop the crossing. The Mediterranean was about to show Rome that it did not need Carthage's help to destroy a fleet. The Roman army landed in North Africa and pushed inland. For a time, the gamble seemed justified. Then the campaign collapsed. In 255 BCE, the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus was defeated and captured near Tunis. Rome had to send another fleet to recover the survivors. The rescue force crossed to Africa, fought a Carthaginian squadron off Cape Hermaeum, and won. Polybius says the Romans captured more than 100 enemy ships before taking the surviving soldiers aboard. Again, a Roman fleet had beaten Carthage. Again, the sea seemed to belong to the side that could force the right kind of battle. Then the fleet turned towards Sicily. Near Camarina, the weather changed. There was no enemy captain to outthink, no deck to pin with an iron spike, no formation to break. There was only wind, surf, rock, and hundreds of heavy wooden hulls trapped along a hostile coastline. Polybius describes the storm in almost apocalyptic language. His numbers are staggering. Of 364 vessels, he says only 80 survived. The rest were swamped, smashed against rocks and headlands, or torn apart in the surf. Wreckage and bodies covered the shore. A fleet that had just defeated Carthage had been destroyed without Carthage firing a shot. Rome had solved the problem of contact. It had not solved navigation, weather, coastal judgment, or the physical punishment of operating hundreds of ships at sea. The Romans had learned how to turn an enemy deck into a battlefield. The Mediterranean had just turned their fleet into debris. And the catastrophe exposed something else about Roman power. Its strength was not efficiency. It was replacement. The survivors returned home, and Rome responded in a way that would have looked irrational to almost any state already bleeding. Timber, money, rowers, soldiers, and ships, it built again. Polybius says 220 new vessels were completed in only 3 months. Think about what that number meant in physical terms. Trees had to become timbers. Timbers had to become ribs, hulls, decks, masts, and oars. Bronze fittings, ropes, sails, anchors, food, water, rowers, marines, and officers all had to be assembled again. Rome had lost ships. It had not lost the political machinery capable of replacing them. The rebuilt fleet returned to Sicily and continued operations. Then another major storm destroyed more than 150 ships. This time, even Roman persistence reached a limit. After repeated disasters, Rome reduced its naval effort and for years avoided the kind of massive fleet operations that had defined the middle of the war. For the first time, the experiment seemed to be breaking, but weather was not the only thing capable of exposing Roman weakness. In 249 BCE, the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher believed he had found an opportunity at Drepana. Rome had received 10,000 replacement sailors in Sicily. Nearby lay a Carthaginian fleet under Adherbal. Pulcher wanted surprise. He embarked the new crews, selected strong marines from the army, and sailed shortly after midnight. The Roman fleet hugged the coast. By dawn, its leading ships were entering the harbor at Drepana. From Pulcher's perspective, the geometry looked perfect. Get inside quickly, catch the Carthaginians before they could organize, turn the harbor into a cage. But now picture that dawn from Adherbal's position. Roman ships were already appearing at the entrance. If he waited, the harbor protecting his fleet would become a prison. So he did not wait. Adherbal gathered rowing crews from shore, called mercenary soldiers aboard, and led his fleet out along the opposite side of the harbor before the Roman line could close. That decision changed the entire battlefield. Pulcher suddenly saw Carthaginian ships moving toward open water instead of remaining trapped inside. Some Roman vessels were already in the harbor. Others crowded the entrance. Still more were arriving from behind. He ordered the fleet to reverse. The result was chaos. Ships turning back collided with ships still coming forward. Oars snapped. Captains tried to force damaged hulls through the entrance while shouted orders disappeared into noise. One delay could turn a surprise attack into a fleet trapped by its own approach. By the time the Romans escaped the harbor and formed a line, the Sicilian coast was directly behind them. Adherbal had the opposite geometry. Open sea behind Carthage, shore behind Rome. He sent vessels around the Roman flank and formed the rest of his fleet for battle. When the signals rose, both sides advanced. At first, Roman marines kept the fighting dangerous, but the decisive weapon was no longer the corvus. It was space. A Carthaginian ship under pressure could back away into open water, turn, recover, and attack again. Other ships could move behind the line and support a threatened vessel. The Romans had nowhere to go. A ship driven backward could enter shallow water and ground. Another could run onto the shore. The Roman crews struggled to execute the maneuvers needed to reverse the situation. The bridge had taught Rome how to survive contact. It had not taught Rome how to control the water before contact. This time, the Carthaginian commander had read the battle correctly. Pulcher escaped along the coast with only a fraction of his fleet. Polybius says 93 Roman ships were captured with their crews. Apart from the men who managed to run vessels ashore and escape, there was no storm to blame. Rome had chosen the battle. Adherbal had chosen where the battle would actually be fought. Mylae had shown how Roman infantry could neutralize superior seamanship at close range. Drepana showed the limit of that solution. If Rome could not create the contact it wanted, the old naval skills still decided who maneuvered, who escaped, and whose ships remained afloat. The shortcut had failed. For years afterward, Rome largely stepped back from the kind of major fleet battle it had once seemed ready to dominate. But the war did not end. It only became more expensive. On western Sicily, Roman forces still faced Carthaginian positions around Drepana, Lilybaeum, and Mount Eryx. Hamilcar Barca kept pressure on the Romans, while the Carthaginian war effort remained connected to the sea. Rome could hold ground. It could not finish the campaign. By 243 and 242 BCE, the problem was no longer simply military. It was financial. Polybius says the public treasury no longer had enough money to equip another major fleet. After more than 2 decades of war, this should have ended the Roman naval experiment. Instead, Rome changed the system again. Wealthy citizens supplied the money themselves. One man might finance a quinquerem. Sometimes 2 or 3 shared the cost. The expectation was simple. If the expedition succeeded, the state would repay them. If it failed, there might be very little left to repay anyone. This was not patriotism expressed in speeches. It meant purchasing timber, bronze, rope, sails, oars, equipment, provisions, and an entire fighting vessel before anyone knew whether that ship would ever come home. By these means, Rome prepared roughly 200 quinqueremes, and this time the answer to failure was not simply more ships. The new fleet was built with greater attention to performance, using a captured fast vessel as a model. Better ships mattered. Better crews mattered more. Gaius Lutatius Catulus took the fleet to Sicily in 242 BCE and found Carthage without a major fleet immediately ready to oppose him. He occupied the approaches around Drepana and Lilybaeum, increased pressure on the remaining Carthaginian positions, and waited for the response he knew had to come. But while he waited, he trained. Every day, according to Polybius, Roman crews practiced the maneuvers they would need in battle. Row, turn, reverse, hold formation, do it again. A generation earlier, Roman rowers had reportedly practiced movements while sitting on benches on dry land. because their fleet did not yet exist. Now Roman crews were drilling in operational warships in enemy waters. That is the transformation hidden inside the First Punic War. The hardware had changed. More importantly, the men had changed. Rome had spent the early war trying to make naval skill matter less. Now it was preparing to win because naval skill finally mattered more. Then the sails appeared. Carthage was coming back. The relief fleet was commanded by Hanno and carried the thing Hamilcar's army in Sicily urgently needed: supplies. The Carthaginian plan made sense. Cross to western Sicily, unload the grain and equipment, lighten the ships, take aboard better fighting men from Hamilcar's forces. Then, if necessary, fight Rome. Catulus understood what that sequence meant. If Hanno completed it, the Romans would face lighter ships carrying stronger marines. The easiest Carthaginian fleet to fight was the one still burdened with cargo. On March 10, 241 BCE, the weather seemed to favor Hanno. A strong wind helped drive the Carthaginian fleet towards Sicily. The sea was rough. For the Romans, interception meant rowing through difficult water against conditions that favored the enemy's movement. Catulus had a choice: wait for better weather and face a stronger enemy later, or accept the worst sea and attack the weaker enemy now. One delay could turn an overloaded relief fleet into a reinforced battle fleet. So Catulus chose the worst sea. Roman soldiers boarded. Pilots received their instructions. The fleet moved out to block Hanno's route near the Aegates Islands. The Carthaginians could no longer simply pass through. They prepared for battle. And now the transformation of the Roman navy became visible. At Drepana, Roman ships had been poorly positioned. Their crews struggled to maneuver, and the coast had trapped them. At Aegates, Polybius describes almost the reverse. The Roman ships had been lightened for combat. Their rowers had been drilled. Their marines were selected from experienced troops. Across the water, Hanno's vessels were still burdened with supplies. His crews had been assembled for a relief mission, and his fighting men were not yet the veterans he hoped to collect in Sicily. The navy that had once depended on inherited skill arrived before it could assemble its strongest version. The navy that had once depended on a boarding device arrived prepared to maneuver. That was the final reversal. The fleets collided west of Sicily. Bronze rams struck timber. Oars churned through rough water. Ships turned for another attack while others closed into boarding range. The surviving ancient narrative does not preserve every movement clearly enough to reconstruct the battle minute by minute. The result is clearer. Polybius says 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk and 70 more captured. Nearly 10,000 men were taken prisoner. The rest escaped when changing conditions allowed them to break away. But the strategic damage could not be reversed. The cargo had not reached Hamilcar. The relief fleet had failed before it could unload, lighten, reinforce, and return. If Hanno had broken through, the war in Sicily could have continued. Instead, Carthage now faced the problem Rome had faced at the beginning of the war. An army could hold ground, but without control of the water around that ground, holding it became harder to sustain. Negotiations followed. Carthage agreed to evacuate Sicily. The First Punic War was over. Rome had not conquered the entire Mediterranean in a single stroke. It had not made Carthaginian naval tradition meaningless, and it had not won because one miraculous machine solved warfare at sea. The war had cost both powers, fleets, crews, money, and years they could never recover. But something fundamental had changed. At the beginning, Rome had looked at naval warfare and seen a system built around skills it did not possess, so it copied the hull. Then, it changed the fight. Then, the sea punished it. Carthage exposed it. Rome rebuilt. And eventually, Rome learned the skills it had once tried to avoid needing. That is why the corvus matters. Not because it was the perfect naval weapon. It was not. Its importance was that it bought an inexperienced fleet a different kind of battle at the moment Rome needed one. The bridge was a shortcut, not mastery. And shortcuts become dangerous when the enemy adapts, when weather changes, or when the battlefield refuses to cooperate. Rome survived long enough to learn that lesson. Today, the seabed around the Aegates Islands still holds the physical remains of the final battle: bronze rams, helmets, amphorae, and fragments of a war that disappeared beneath the water more than 2,000 years ago. Wooden hulls rotted away. The corvus left no monument, but the bronze rams survived. That is the final irony. Rome began its naval revolution by finding a way to make the ram, the maneuver, and the experienced sailor matter less. It ended the war with a fleet that could finally operate in the same world those weapons belonged to. The bridge was gone. Rome was still there. Rome did not conquer the sea by inventing one perfect weapon. It conquered its own weakness until the weapon was no longer necessary. Subscribe for more hidden turning points where armies changed history not by becoming stronger overnight, but by changing what strength meant.